Okay, so the goal of the next couple of videos that you're receiving is just review material from the beginning of the year. We did not do a flipped classroom the whole time, and so you don't have videos on this content, but you've got a weekend before your AP test, and I thought if you want to review, this is one way to do it. This is going to be super fast. I'm trying to give you as much content as possible. If you remember, Unit 1 was ecology. These are the four big ideas of bio. You don't need to know these, but we split it into four big ideas. Ecology is the study of organisms and their interactions with their environment. That means living things, non-living things. We divide our idea of ecology into these levels of organization. Basically, the individual, a group of individuals makes up a population, multiple population makes up a community, ecosystem, biosphere. There are four types of ecology that we talked about. Organismal, also behavioral ecology, looking at a specific physiology and behavior of one individual. Population ecology, the interactions within a group of one species, so a herd of deer, a group of ants. Community, how different species interact. And then ecosystem ecology is looking at the abiotic factors and how they interact with the biotic factors. Um, Question, you can pause this if you want to, but I'm moving forward. Again, this is review if you want to use it. So when we talk about the laws of thermodynamics, first law of thermodynamics, hopefully you remember it. If not, ask me about it. And we talk about how abiotic factors, non-living things, interact with biotic factors. Again, when we look at the different cycles, right, the carbon cycle, the water cycle, the nitrogen cycle, those chemicals are sometimes part of plants, animals, their food. Sometimes they're in the air, sometimes they're in the water, and that would be considered abiotic factors. And so these chemicals that are cycled through, they can be part of the biotic or abiotic factors at any point, and that's how all these things interact. Why are the abiotic factors important? They determine which animals can survive where. If there is not a lot of oxygen somewhere, an abiotic factor, it's going to limit what type of organisms can live somewhere. If it is very cold, that's an abiotic factor, temperature, it's going to limit what can live in that area. When we talk about, we've seen this many, many times, that there's also an importance in biotic factors, right? Species are dependent on species. When we looked at when we had sea urchin and limpets, or these like little shelled organisms, when they're both present, basically we see a certain increase in seaweed. When we only remove the sea urchins, we see still an increase, but if we remove both of these organisms or only limpets, the sea urchins basically feed on that seaweed and we have none. Basically indicating that these interactions between species are very, very important and they're the key between a healthy, successful ecosystem and a dying one. When we talk about more abiotic factors, temperature and your latitude, so where you are on the globe, determines what sort of species we see. The macroclimate of an area is the global, regional, and like landscape level. So that's like rain, clouds, sun, temperature. That impacts a big or many populations. Microclimate is very specific locations under a log in a certain pond, and then it has its own like special climate that can impact it. My macroclimate can change depending on seasons with light and temperature. Where I am on the globe, if I am closer to the equator, obviously my humidity and my temperature is going to change. I also see different weather patterns depending on my latitude. And so all of these things impact, in turn, my biotic factors. what we do know is that the climate is slowly changing, and this can be a really bad thing, right? Uh, there's stuff melting, there's things dying, it's changing the climate, and if we know that the climate impacts my biodiversity and the type of species that can exist, we can predict that the more that it changes in a negative way, the less biodiversity we're going to have. Talking about homeostasis, we need to regulate it in a small scale, like a person, or a large scale. There are certain organisms that are regulators. They maintain basically constant internal temperatures. We would be regulators, right? Conformers, they adapt, right? Snakes, reptiles, they adapt to their environment because they try to live in environments that are pretty stable anyway. If I live in the desert, my year-round temperature stays pretty much the same. So we see that depending on where we move past the equator, talking about Pangea, that can impact like what type of species we see on the different continents. When we talk about like ecology, we also want to think about where it all started, studying animals and biotic factors, and that starts with historical biogeography, which is basically they started to notice that we must have had Pangea because there were similar species that are in fossils now, but they covered all of the continents, and so we predict that at one point we were all in this set area, and then they spread out, they moved their latitude, and that's why some things went extinct. There is current biogeography too, not just historical biogeography. This looks at any, what we call a range or a distribution of certain organisms. Large ranges means they are much more adaptable, whereas a very small range means that they can only exist in that one set area. This is talking a little bit about leopards. It's just an example. Pause it if you want to. And so the final thing you need to really know about biogeography is that it ties together location and organisms, right? And what we do know is that the location and all of those abiotic factors, rain, sun, heat, determines my bio part, right? What I have, what organisms I have there. And it determines distribution of species. Pause these if you really want to, but not necessary. Okay, so big picture ecology, biological systems interact, and they have specific properties that determine how they interact. Abiotic and biotic factors influence all the different levels of ecology, and over time, species have adapted, died, or moved to more suitable environments. I'm going to pause really quick, and then we're going to talk about the next slide. And I'm back with a coat on because it's cold in here. General ecology. Next one is population ecology. Population is a group of individuals of the same species. Hi, you can come in. Come on in. Oh my god, okay. This video is just not fated to be today because you keep interrupting. So population, same species, a group of them. So like a herd of deer, something like that. I know that I talked about how the first level is individual or behavioral. We'll talk about that at the end. Distribution patterns. You should know this, right? Within an area, sometimes organisms want to clump together. Sometimes they are uniform. Sometimes they're random, right? And that depends on probably the social behavior of the organisms the most. What causes them to clump? Sometimes it's avoiding predators, having a common prey, being in packs or not being in packs. It really depends. Dispersal shows how they spread, whereas distribution shows how they exist. Dispersal is also like a long-term thing. So over 100 years, where did this group of organisms start? Where did they move to? In long distance dispersal, so like over a very far distance, Like we see here, we have adaptive radiation, which hopefully you remember is a type of speciation. Adaptive radiation, it becomes a new species after moving far away. Again, we see here the dispersal of honeybees, where they started and then where the African honeybees spread out. Hopefully you'd be able to interpret like why this graph looks the way that it does. Some organisms have a very small geographic range, whereas some have a really large one, which means their dispersal is going to be very much larger, a lot larger because they have further to move. So basically, something with a large geographic range means that it is very capable of adapting or existing in a variety of climates. It also means that they can interact with a large variety of organisms. When we look at kangaroos, they usually stay within a certain area, and they don't. I mean, there's a few, right, when we look at this map, but they want to have limited interactions with other organisms. A way that we study how they spread and how many organisms there are within a population is the mark and recapture technique. So basically, what I will do is I'll mark 10 organisms, I'll release them into the wild, and then I'll come back and I'll recapture another 10. Arguably, if my population is really small, I'll already capture organisms that were numbered last time. Whereas if my population is very large, I would assume that I won't pick up as many numbered organisms. Don't worry about being able to do this math. I've never seen it on an AP question. Knock on wood. Now that I said that, I feel like it's going to pop up. But we'll talk about this if you want to talk about it. Survivorship curves. I'm not going to go over this. You guys know this, hopefully. Pause it if you want to. Also, population growth curves, right? Logistic versus exponential. You know this too. J and S, right? The J curve versus the S curve, same thing. Carrying capacity, right? When we hit carrying capacity, boom. Reproductive strategies are selected. These are going to be your, what would be exponential growth, right? Short maturation and lifespan, lots of little offspring, reproduce really frequently, parents don't take care of them, high death rate, but the population can grow very fast, very large if there's no limiting factors. K-selected is going to be long maturation and lifespan. They give birth to one baby very infrequently, and there's a lot of parent care because if that one dies, that's the one offspring that dies. So we see that even my R-selected species, like a bacteria or a fly, they're going to end up hitting carrying capacity at some point. Although with unlimited resources, they could become something else. Lemmings we'll skip over. Knowing how to interpret this, hopefully we know. Pause and take a look at this if you need to. Natural selection. This is going to basically shape what my population looks like. We also talk about this later on in evolution, so I won't talk about it now. Modes of selection, so how does my population change? Disruptive, I get two very different groups. Stabilizing, they all start to look more and more similar. Directional, they all move in one direction as when it comes to traits. You've seen these a bunch. Pause if you need to. We've talked about this again. And I'm running out of time. Okay, we'll stop at the hydrangea flower. This will pick up at the next video. And then we'll wrap up pretty quickly.